What were the toughest things to deal with through this whole thing? Probably the toughest, or the first one I have to think of, was my son's wedding. He was getting married 3 months and 1 day exactly from the day I was diagnosed. And the day they called and told me I had cancer, that, to be honest with you, was one of the first things that popped into my mind. The wedding was out in Colorado. We lived in Virginia, and I was bound and determined that I was going to go. I remember my sister and I meeting with my radiation oncologist for, gosh, well over an hour. And we sat and we visited with him, and he went over everything that could possibly happen to me. He mentioned the burn and the sore throat and everything that was going to happen. And when he finished, I looked at my sister, and she looked at me, and she said, "Go ahead and tell him." So I looked at Dr. Kandawal and I said, "I'm sorry." I said, "But my son is getting married." And I said, "I plan to be at the wedding." I said, "I plan to go to Colorado for it." And he looked at me and he looked a little stunned, and he looked and he said, "Oh, I am really sorry." He said, "But I just do not see how that's going to be possible." I looked at him, I looked back at my sister, and my sister looked and she said, "Well, you're dealing with a mama bear." So we struggled with it. It was difficult, but back and forth we went, and eventually when it came time for the wedding, the doctor worked with me. We did everything possible. I had to delay treatment for a day or two, but I was able to go. My cousin worked for the airline. She literally walked me onto the plane and made sure we got onto the plane, and I was able to go to the wedding. So that was a real blessing. I still didn't have much taste buds. I couldn't eat much, and I was really fatigued, but I figured it wasn't something I could redo. So I just went and I enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I danced at the wedding, I ate at the wedding, and I just kind of remember they hadn't scheduled the mother son dance because they figured that it may not be it may not be able to happen if something happened and I wasn't able to go. So they just decided not to plan on it. So then they all of a sudden they surprised us and they called my son and I up to dance. And I remember dancing with my son and him just saying to me at the time, he said, "Mama, I needed two things today." And he said, "First of all and foremost, I needed her to say I do." And he said, "The second was I needed you there." So that was a real special moment that I will never forget, and something that I will really treasure because I know how hard everyone fought to get me there and how hard I fought to get there. One of the other big challenges was work. It was difficult to maintain a job. I was able to work. I was diagnosed May 2014, and I continued working until March 2016. I stopped in March of 2016. I had a great boss and I had a great group of coworkers. I worked with my best friend, and I worked with a lot of good friends, and they all had my back and they all covered my job when I wasn't able to be there. But it was difficult because I was not the type of person who was able to just sit back and let others do my job and not feel bad about it. So it was difficult for me. In December 2016, I ended up with C. diff. I had been sick right before Christmas, and I ended up in the hospital with a high fever, and they weren't able to exactly figure out what was wrong, but they got me stable, and I was able to come home for Christmas. And then a couple of days later, I ended up back in the hospital, and at that point, they had figured out that I had C. diff. So after that, I was back home. I was in the hospital for several days, and then I was back home and unable to return to work. And at that point, my husband and I decided the best thing would be for me to just take early retirement. I think that was a battle that I had fought for a long time, and I just felt that it was one that it was time to just take early retirement. So that's what I did. Another one of my biggest challenges was my hip, and just basically my body fighting with my own body throughout this whole thing. I later into the journey, I did find out that I had cancer in my hip, and that was a very scary moment to find that out. And then also with that, I was on steroids. I was also had the radiation to my hip, and basically the cancer, the radiation, and the steroids had eaten away at my hip, and eventually I was diagnosed with avascular necrosis in the left hip, which eventually led to total hip replacement, which I just had this past November. It was probably about 9 months from when I was first diagnosed with the avascular necrosis until they were actually able to do the surgery. The reason being, the surgeon wanted me off of all steroids, and the oncologist and the rheumatoid specialists were a little leery of taking me off the steroids, and so was I, because we knew that as soon as that happened, the RA would flare up again, and so we basically waited and tried to find another solution to the RA in the meantime so I could get off the steroids. So there was a good 9 months in there where I was, without the surgery, and being in a lot of pain. I remember several days I had to get up and just make a conscious decision that I was going to go out and do what I wanted to do, despite how painful it is. Some days I also had to learn that it was too painful, and I had to say no to things, and I had to learn to rest. So that was probably the biggest challenges between my hip and my RA. I had to learn to deal with my own body. I had to learn to fight through pain and to work through it and make the most of my life and go out and enjoy my life. But I also had to learn when I couldn't do it. And I had to learn to lean on others. I had to let others help me. That's not one of the easy things for me to do, but I did. I had to learn to let others help me and to be very willing and accepting of their help. I also, a good friend of mine once told me that when I don't allow others to do for me, that I'm taking away their blessing too. So that was one thing that I had to learn, and a big challenge for me to deal with.